Welcome to our last lesson in our growth group, Living in an Imperfect World. And this lesson, I hope that you'll really listen with an open heart and open mind, because this lesson is so vitally important. Everybody can say this applies to you. And I hope you really take this to heart. The topic today is recovering from rejection. The Bible says in Judges chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty man of valor, and he was a son of a harlot. And Gilead begat Jephthah. And Gilead's wife bare him sons, and his wife's sons grew up. And they thrust out Jephthah, and said unto him, Thou shalt not inherit in our father's house, for thou art the son of a strange woman. Then Jephthah fled from his brethren, and dwelt in the land of Tob. And there were gathered vain men to Jephthah, and he went out with them. Jephthah is the prime example of someone who suffered from rejection. It's important to realize at the very beginning that his rejection was without a basis. Whose fault was it that Jephthah was the son of a harlot? It was his parents' fault. Jephthah had nothing to do with it. Innocent individuals shouldn't bear any blame from things that they're not under their control. But unfortunately, frequently that happens, and they experience the pain of rejection. Jephthah's half-brothers didn't want anything to do with him. They cast him out of the house so that they wouldn't have to share their inheritance. There would come a day when they turned to him for help, though, but the pain of rejection that he had suffered as a young man colored Jephthah's response and led him to make a very foolish vow that totally damaged his family. There are 7 principles in the story of Jephthah that help us understand where rejection comes from and how we should respond to it properly. The first principle is this: the presence of rejection. Virtually everyone has felt rejected at some point in his life. Maybe another child was favored by his parents. Perhaps a teacher treated someone else in the class better. Whatever the cause or the setting, the pain of rejection is very real. Let's talk about the causes of rejection. Some people are rejected because of their background. Often they're rejected because of their race, social status, appearance, abilities, or lack thereof. Nobody should ever be rejected for any of those reasons. The things that unite us in the family of God are far greater than anything that could divide us. If a person is handsomer than someone else, that doesn't make him any better in God's eyes. The lack of physical beauty or attractive appearance shouldn't make anyone matter less to us. James chapter 2 actually tells us that judging someone because of their appearance is a sign of evil thinking. Jephthah had nothing to do with the situation that led to his rejection. It wasn't his fault that his mother was a harlot and his father had been immoral. But it's interesting that his brothers didn't criticize their father. I believe it's because they were focused on the inheritance they would get from him. They used the circumstances of Jephthah's brother against him because they didn't want Jephthah to have any part of the inheritance. Sometimes people are rejected because of their behavior. To a certain extent, we have some control over whether some people reject us because of our behavior. But it isn't always because of bad behavior that we're rejected. David was rejected by Saul because of his good behavior. He did nothing to justify the way Saul treated him. The prodigal son was rejected by his brother because of bad behavior. He took his father's money and wasted it in pursuing pleasure and wicked living. His brother resented that and refused to welcome him when he returned home. When we're rejected, we need to examine our behavior and see if we've done something that might explain the rejection. If the rejection is due to our bad behavior, we need to take steps to make things right. But if our behavior doesn't justify rejection, we can be confident knowing that we are to blame for the situation. Jesus talked about this kind of situation in the Sermon on the Mount. He said this, he said, Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. You see, the rejection that comes because of good behavior brings a blessing from God. We should never allow the kind of rejection to alter the way we act. Now, the conduits of rejection. There are many ways rejection can come into our lives. One of them is this way. Rejection can come from our family. This was the case with Jephthah. Those who should have been closest to him turned their backs on him completely. There is probably no more painful rejection than that which comes from our own flesh and blood. Sometimes rejection comes from our friends. Those we have depended on and relied on the most can turn away from us. The prophet Zechariah foretold what would happen to Jesus. He said this, "And one shall say unto him, What are these wounds in thy hands? Then he shall answer, Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends." Sometimes rejection comes from our foes. Now, although this kind of rejection is not as painful as other kinds, it still stings. The danger in dealing with rejection from our enemies is that we're tempted to compromise our beliefs and standards in order to be accepted, and that never works. Our enemies will not accept us even if we lower ourselves to their level. There are certain products of rejection. The first one is confusion. People who have been rejected don't know who loves them, who's for real, who they can trust or who to believe. They're suspicious of others' actions and motives because they've been hurt and they don't want to be hurt again. On the other hand, they tend to be desperately eager for some kind of acceptance. They're willing to take great risks in order to belong. When men of Gilead came and asked Jephthah to lead them into battle, he leaped at the chance. Jephthah didn't ask who they were fighting and what kind of army their enemies had or what the risks involved were. The only thing he wanted to know was if they were serious about their offer to give him leadership if he won the battle. There's also contention. People who have suffered rejection don't trust others easily. They find it easier to fuss and argue than to get along with others. They come to every relationship with their fences up. They have a chip on their shoulder. They're willing to fight at the drop of a hat, and they will drop the hat. Because they've not received grace and acceptance from others, they find it very difficult to extend it to others. Another result of rejection is compliance. People who have been rejected often reach out for acceptance. They're so desperate for someone to give them attention that they will do almost anything to get it. These people are looking for somebody to tell them they belong. Their loneliness and pain drive them to agree to do things, even things they know are wrong, so they can have someone who will accept them. Over the years, I've talked to and counseled a number of ladies who were living in immoral relationships with men. Usually, these men were bums. It was not uncommon for these women to be supporting these men financially. Now, these were not the kind of women you would expect to be immoral. Often, these people had grown up in church. And for a long time, I didn't understand why anyone would be willing to live like that. Sometimes they would end up in one relationship and they would stop that one and jump right into another one that was just as bad, if not worse. I finally realized that the thing motivating their behavior was their desire to find somebody who would accept them. Rejection produces a desire for acceptance that leads to a vicious cycle where things get worse and worse. Every betrayal or mistreatment confirms their belief that they don't deserve any better. They continue to search, but they'll never find true acceptance in that kind of behavior. If they go down this process and down this road, they will finally end up in corruption. Those rejected are frequently bitter people. Sometimes they're bitter at the person who rejected them. Sometimes they're bitter at themselves. They feel that somehow it must be their fault. Sometimes they're bitter at God. They reason that if God really loved them, he would not have let anything so painful happen to them. Rejection produced corruption in the life of Absalom. David refused to allow him to return to the palace after he arranged for the murder of Amnon for the rape of Tamar. For 5 years, David held him at arm's length. And during that period, Absalom's bitterness over the rejection planted the seed of his revolt against his father. If rejection is not properly dealt with, it can lead to all kinds of sins. So let's talk about the principles for dealing with rejection. Please hear me on this. Birth does not determine blessing. Jephthah was rejected because of the circumstances of his birth. It's a blessing to have a godly heritage. You can look back and thank God for your childhood and the values your parents taught you. But whether your background is positive or negative does not make you acceptable to God. The circumstances of your birth don't determine how worthwhile you are. They may lead others to reject you, but God never will. You can rise above where you started when you became a Christian. God made you a new creature. Where you began life has nothing to do with how your life turns out unless you allow it to dictate your behavior. Here's some principles. First of all, relative importance of acceptance. Relative importance of acceptance. Some things are more important than being accepted by your adversary. Some people will do almost anything to be accepted by people who don't even love them. Lot was Abraham's nephew. He made the trip from Ur to the Promised Land along with Abraham. He fellowshiped on a daily basis with the most godly man in the world at that time. But rather than desiring the acceptance of the godly, the Bible says Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. Eventually, he moved in the city and became a political leader. He was even willing to sacrifice his own daughter's purity and virtue to be accepted by the most wicked of men, calling them brethren. His desire to be accepted by the ungodly corrupted him. Listen, lowering your standards to gain acceptance of the ungodly will destroy you, and it still won't always gain you their approval. The men of Sodom only wanted Lot for what they could get out of him. I encourage those who I'm counseling to remember that sometimes it's good that some people don't like you. I want you also to realize why acceptance was withheld. Rejection often has little or nothing to do with you. Some who have been badly treated by their parents tend to internalize that and wonder what's wrong with them. They wonder what made their parents hateful toward them. These will never gain a feeling of acceptance until they realize that it probably was nothing they did that caused that rejection. Those who spend their whole lives trying to make up for something they never did wrong are following a recipe for disaster. When Samuel was old, the nation of Israel asked him to appoint a king over them. He was distressed because he realized that he was wrong. That was the wrong thing to do. But I focus attention on God's answer to Samuel. They have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. You see, there was no reason for Samuel to feel rejected. He was not the one that people were turning against. It's proper to analyze what's happened when we're rejected. If we have done something that may have contributed to the rejection, we should try to make things right. But it may well be that the rejection has nothing to do with us at all. Number 3, recompense later above acceptance now. Here's what I mean. It's more important to obey God than to be popular. I've seen people who weren't interested in hearing the gospel. And sometimes no one would answer the doorbell if they looked out and saw me on the porch. If you know God and you know the gospel, the people need you. That's far more important than them wanting you. Focus on what is most important rather than allowing rejection by others to get you off track. Number 4, reaching too far for acceptance. A desire for acceptance can cloud your judgment. Jephthah didn't stop to consider the danger of the consequences of getting involved in the battle. His thought was this: if we could just win this battle, all my troubles would be over. I'd finally be accepted. People would look up to me. I'd finally get some respect. I'd be somebody. You know, a lot of time people who had a tough upbringing really go out of their way to prove themselves. They have to be accepted. Frequently, they pay a very high price for that. The desire for acceptance overrides their judgment. You know, many gangs have a brutal initiation process. They require a new member to endure a beating from all the other members. Now, why would a person put up with such treatment? Because they want to belong more than they want anything else. Listen, people are important, and we should love them. We should look for ways to help them and enjoy having fellowship with them, but only God is necessary. A rejected person may say, but I need whatever or whoever. But the real answer is this: you only need God. He will bring everything into your life that you need to have. Accept His provision and be satisfied with it. There are reasons for acceptance from some. Most people who accept or reject you do so for selfish reasons. It's part of a sinful man nature to focus on ourselves. When people come to me feeling bad about rejection, I might ask them this questions, or ask them some questions to help them put things in perspective. How many have you been a help and blessing to who give you nothing back? Some we want to help because they make us laugh. Sometimes we help people because it makes us feel superior. Some people show us so much gratitude that it makes us feel important. And often we accept or reject people for selfish reasons. Others are the same way with us. Rather than allowing the rejection to derail you, reflect on the fact that they probably made that decision for their own selfish reasons. Reciprocal acceptance is not always wise. Don't base your opinion of others on their opinion of you. Jephthah was hated and rejected by his half-brothers, but when they showed him a little attention and offered him acceptance, he went back to them like a yo-yo. He didn't stop to think about what was right and wrong. He didn't ask God what he should do. He didn't ask, will this please the Lord? He just wanted to know if they really meant to make him their leader if he won the battle for them. Now, you see, our natural tendency is to think that those who like us are nice people. And if they don't, then they're rotten people. We like the person who's nasty to others but nice to us. We don't like the person who is good to everybody else but not to us. Now listen, that's a poor basis for forming an opinion about someone's character. Some are so very complimentary. They flatter, they praise, they build up with their words. And over the years, I've learned that their words often cannot be trusted. Just because those words are said doesn't mean we should form our opinion of that person on those words. There are some good people who don't like me. I don't want to fall into the trap of evaluating them on that basis. I should admire, respect, and appreciate good people, even if they don't respect and appreciate me. Jephthah thought his brothers were mean, vindictive, prejudiced, narrow-minded, and petty until the day they said, "Come back and lead our army." On the day they said that, their character and nature had not changed one bit. They were still mean, vindictive, prejudiced, narrow-minded, and petty. The only thing that changed was Jephthah's perception of them. Now that their bad attitudes were directed towards someone else, he thought their acceptance meant something else. Listen, don't allow yourself to be swayed by the words or opinions of others. Base your judgments and decisions on what is right and what's wrong, not on what people think about you. Rethinking beliefs for acceptance is a mistake. Don't let the chance of acceptance change your values. If you had asked Jephthah, is there anything for which you would surrender your daughter? I believe he would have said no. Even if the equation had been that he could have had the acceptance of his brothers, he still would have refused surrendering his daughter. But that wasn't the way the choice was presented. The chance for acceptance which was offered to him caused him to say, "I'll do anything to get this." Jephthah made a foolish vow to God. His vow was this: if he won the victory, he would offer up the first thing that came out of the house on his return. He wasn't thinking of the cost. He was exclusively focused on gaining the acceptance of those who had rejected him. It was only after the battle was won that Jephthah learned that the price of his acceptance was his only child. Now, Bible scholars have debated for years on whether or not she was actually put to death. I personally don't think she was, and she should not have been. One should never make or fulfill a promise that requires you to do wrong. But in either event, the cost of Jephthah's desire for acceptance was much too high. Some people are so bent on acquiring material possessions that they spend little or no time with their families or serving God. When they want to succeed, so they'll be accepted, they often sacrifice their children in the process. There's a man in the Bible named Hiel. Hiel rebuilt the city of Jericho even though Joshua had pronounced a curse on anyone who did so. And in 1 Kings 16, the Bible tells us that he laid the foundation and set up the gates in his sons. We don't know for sure whether he was following the ancient pagan custom of sacrificing his own children or whether God killed them. But his desire to gain fame and acceptance by his accomplishments cost him the lives of his own children. Don't ever allow a desire for acceptance to override what is most important. The pain of rejection is very real. Many people suffer throughout all their lives because of that pain. But by applying God's remedy for rejection through these principles, we really can overcome the pain and live happy and successful lives.